At the Pentagon, mobs of activists gather in the parking lots, howling for their blood, egged on by White House staff members who are cruising the parking lots of the Pentagon, pumping their fists in their limousines and tweeting their support for the blood mob. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. And welcome today to the Cultural Revolution. Because China's Cultural Revolution was so vast and Byzantine, we're doing something new today, a thought experiment, to help us wrap our minds around the incomprehensible, terrifying, technicolor, bat guano lunacy. Imagine that the President of the United States has a theory of permanent revolution. He believes that the country can only remain free of corruption and gridlock and thought crime in local government and Congress if it continually revolts against local government and Congress, not against the White House. Note, absolutely no revolution against the White House, but continuous ferment and actual political upheaval against local government and Congress. Well, that's an interesting theory, and he's done his best to put it into practice fitfully before, but you might say real permanent revolution has never been tried. And so, the president and his wife, the first lady, who is a former Hollywood actress turned political activist, they see an opportunity and they team up with another powerful figure, the president's heir apparent, the Secretary of Defense. Now, in this administration, the president is actually not very close to the vice president. In fact, in some ways, they're political rivals. There's a certain tension between the president and the VP. And I'm told this isn't uncommon at all in American administrations. So no, the president's real political right-hand man, and actually his heir apparent and successor, is the Secretary of Defense, who publicly is a celebrated general from the country's past. But in private, he is a very weird guy. The Secretary of Defense is a hypochondriac with an eating disorder and social anxiety so crippling that he prefers to spend all the time that he can sequestered in his home office with the curtains drawn, because it's there that he can avoid drafts and things that are cold to the touch, like glasses of water or phone receivers. In fact, he prefers not to take telephone calls at all, but if there's a true emergency, like one of the ones that we'll see today, he prefers to have an aide take the phone call from outside the room and then poke his head into the office and repeat the substance of the conversation to the Secretary of Defense. But even then, the Secretary of Defense will rarely actually take a decision on his own. The person who actually runs things for him day to day is his wife. She, Mrs. Secretary of Defense, is a powerful insider in her own right, a very formidable person inside the DC Beltway, and also between the sheets, where she cuckolds her husband with his Pentagon aide. With this crack top-level leadership team in place, let the permanent revolution begin. Let's see what happens, Team America. Well, because the president and the first lady believe that the children are our future, we should teach them well and let them lead the way, they decide to let the permanent revolution begin in the Washington, D.C. school system. An elite girls' high school leads the way. The teenage daughters of top government officials beat to death their homeroom teacher for imagined thought crimes. The death blows against the poor matronly teacher are struck by the 11th grade daughter of the Vice President of the United States and the daughter of the Senate Majority Leader. The adolescent daughter of the mayor of DC, who is a terrifying psychopath, is also implicated, but happens not to be present when the poor teacher expires. And across the DC public school system, when the schools return from summer vacation, it turns out that in short order, 100 teachers and other grown-ups are beaten to death in just one of the city's many neighborhoods. The Attorney General takes notice of this and puts out an order saying that this is not necessarily a problem, provided that the students, who are now known as Red Guards, are beating to death the bad people. With that said, Carry on, he says. And he publicly orders law enforcement not to interfere with the activists. So the following day, in a rural county in nearby Virginia, they have an infamous political massacre of political bad people that produces 4 or 5 times as many bodies as Kristallnacht did, only in one fairly podunky farm community. Most of the deaths are produced by beatings, though there are a few decapitations and some boilings. Children are dealt with in a way that cannot be repeated on this channel. The bodies all go into a mass grave that the surviving farm folk of the area call the Pit of 10,000 Corpses. And in fact, in that year in Metro DC, 1 in every 470 residents will become the victim of a political murder, meaning, really, that everybody in that city knows at least one person who has been murdered. 10 times as many families have their homes ransacked by activists looking for evidence of thought crime, and even more are actually expelled from their homes and driven out into the countryside to fend for themselves. While this is happening in the streets, the president and the first lady are preparing to have their rivals, the vice president and his wife, framed for treason. The First Lady will go on to get one of the Vice President's daughters to betray them. They will engineer a ruse to lure the Vice President's wife out of her Secret Service security bubble onto the campus of Columbia University, where they'll have a free hand and she'll be at the mercy of the activists, who are now acting as cat's paws for the president and the first lady. The student activists at Columbia fake a phone call to the vice president's office, claiming that his other daughter, the murderer of her homeroom teacher, has been in a traffic accident. And so the vice president's wife rushes out to see to her daughter. And once at Columbia, she's kidnapped by the activists and taken to a kangaroo court on campus, which has been facilitated behind the scenes by the president and the first lady. In that campus kangaroo court, she is subjected to ritual abuse and then returned to the White House and jailed there in a janitorial room, as well as her husband in a separate janitorial closet. And then eventually they, the vice president and his wife, are transferred to a federal supermax prison. The vice president's wife will be held in solitary confinement there for 12 years, and she'll be surveilled around the clock through a peephole above her toilet. Meanwhile, her husband, who is also in Supermax prison, is slowly being tortured to death. Eventually, his sickly, withered body will be found alone in his cell, soiled with his own feces and blood. And then he will be condemned publicly as a traitor, and his name will become synonymous with infamy. At that point, the president and the first lady will finally allow the children of the deceased vice president to learn where their parents have been disappeared to, namely federal supermax prison. And he'll permit a visit with their surviving mother. This will be a weird visit because it will include both the daughter who betrayed her and the other daughter, the murderer, who struck the spark that ignited the flame that the president and the first lady fanned into an apocalyptic mass murder firestorm, which is now engulfing America. We'll talk about that firestorm in a minute, but before we leave the leadership circles of DC, the White House Chief of Staff, the president's right-hand man, and the closest thing that he has to a trusted confidant. He, the chief of staff, succumbs to political pressure, and he signs an arrest warrant for his own adopted daughter so that she too can be interrogated for her imaginary thought crimes. She is put into an all-male prison and given to male convicts for purposes that I don't need to spell out. After 7 months of this treatment, she does not survive. What's happening in the rest of the country? If it's even possible for it to be worse than what we've just discussed happening in the DC elite, It is. In New York, things are going pretty much according to the president's overall plan. New York City Hall has been sacked, and Manhattan has declared itself a revolutionary commune called the New York Autonomous Zone. The president tweets out support for this and sends a stream of advisors from the White House to provide guidance to the activists. For the moment, though, things are still fluid in New York because every 3 days, the self appointed leaders of the autonomous commune are overthrown violently and replaced by a new revolutionary junta of activists who have an even longer name for their faction. However, the president is confident that pretty soon the revolutionary process will smooth itself out and everything will get sorted. However, in the rest of America, the magic elixir of permanent revolution is not working the healing magic that the president imagined. The commendable spirit of progress that now flourishes in the New York Autonomous Zone has been slow and fitful in its spread to the American heartland. In fact, most states of the Union have fallen into what the president himself now describes as all out civil war, which he's not necessarily against. The problem is just that the wrong people look like they're winning. The president expected that the activists were going to have an easy, if terrifying, purge that would be over in a few months, and they would sweep out the deadwood in local government, and it would proceed quickly and totalistically, like all previous purges that he's overseen in the government. However, the problem is that this time, around the country, people are fighting back. The country is not exactly warming to the idea of another wave of permanent revolution. In places like Chicago and Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Detroit, the auto workers, steel workers, meat packers, and so on are not excited about a new American Great Leap Forward, where they're going to be asked again to do more with less and accomplish heroic feats of 80-hour work weeks for less money and starvation rations. Of course, those places also have Red Guards, who are mostly student activists from the now defunct high schools and colleges. And those activists who are trying to get the union workers to see the light and embrace more permanent revolution, they are bolstered by wave after wave of self-appointed activist leaders and organizers sent by the White House from Columbia, Princeton, Vassar, and Bryn Mawr. The White House is bussing in those student activist leaders to show middle America how to think correctly. Those activists are full of passion and they're really good at PR and revolutionary rhetoric. However, they prove super annoying to the factory workers who have a lot to lose if their cities are ravaged, again, by political fighting for the fourth or fifth time in 50 years. And those workers prove to be much harder for feral high school kids to beat up than their elderly homeroom teachers were. The workers also tend to have City Hall and the local police forces on their side. In short, when the activists hit the small towns and inland cities, it turns out those places are not really buying the permanent revolution thing that the activists are selling. In Albuquerque, the revolutionary activists decide to seize the local TV network affiliates, figuring they're just following the revolutionary example of the New York Autonomous Zone. And they're very reasonably expecting that they too will be cheered on by the president. However, the ways of the White House are mysterious, and instead, DC orders the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center in 29 Palms to take action in Albuquerque. So, the Marines hit KRQE TV, the local CBS affiliate, like the San Diego Chargers, bowling into a yoga class for elderly people. They kill hundreds and they take thousands of prisoners back to Guantanamo Bay. Some of this gets into the media and it's a bad look. So now the White House chief of staff pivots and he has the commanding Marine general sacked and yanked back to Washington for disciplinary action. What is happening? And what exactly does the White House want now? No one knows, including the White House. Thankfully for the White House, that's just Albuquerque, and nobody cares about New Mexico, right? No, what's most concerning to them is Chicago. Not just because Chicago is a major industrial and transport hub with a long history of political unrest. Also, in Chicago, the military commander for the whole upper Midwest has gone rogue, which is to say, he's upholding the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He and other garrison commanders in different places around America are showing a disturbing amount of spine. See, the White House has gotten worried because it's taken longer than expected for the revolutionary activist wave to take over all the towns in America. And so they've ordered the army to get involved and throw its weight behind them. This has made the army very uncomfortable, not just because by their nature they are a law and order minded institution, but also because they are the last functioning institution left, and they are worried that the door is about to be opened to introduce the political chaos into the army itself. The army has been politicized enough already. So in Chicago and some other places, the army has taken advantage of a loophole to defy Washington's orders. See, when the president ordered them to throw their weight behind this permanent revolution, he gave them super vague orders to go help the good guys. So, in Chicago and elsewhere, the military commanders are surveying their local situation and they're like, who are the good guys here? Is it the mobs who are kidnapping people and ransacking their homes and murdering them? Or is it, say, the mayor and the police department and the PTA? Well, lo and behold, the local military commanders are using their discretion and intelligence to conclude that the good guys in their locale are the ones who are not committing the massacres. This comes to Washington's attention, though, and it causes great consternation. So, the White House decides to make an example of the military commander in Chicago. The Attorney General flies to Chicago with one of the White House's chief consultants on thought crime and political witchcraft. And he shows up in Chicago to denounce the military commander who is maintaining law and order. Unrealistically, they are expecting the people of Chicago to listen respectfully to what they have to say and obey them because, gosh darn it, they're from Washington, D.C. But instead, the Chicago metal workers and some sympathetic military officers kidnap the attorney general and his activism advisor from their hotel, beat them up, and jail them. Washington officials try to fly to O'Hare Airport and calm things down in Chicago, but the Illinois National Guard turns out and closes the runways at O'Hare so that they can't land. So finally, back in DC, the agoraphobic, hypochondriac Secretary of Defense, in his darkened room where he doesn't like to touch telephones, has messages relayed to him by aides from outside the door and does the thing that he most hates doing. He makes a decision. And it's a pretty significant decision. See, the Secretary of Defense now orders the 82nd Airborne to jump into Chicago, into Grant Park and Soldier Field, and seize the city with support from 3 more divisions trucking up from Fort Campbell, whose officers are personally loyal to the Secretary of Defense. And he has the Navy park gunboats in Lake Michigan near Oprah's apartment so that if necessary, they can shell the city of Chicago into pacification. The counter-revolutionary and reactionary officers in Chicago are now hauled back to Washington for questioning. At the Pentagon, where they're being held, mobs of activists gather in the parking lots, howling for their blood. And they are actually egged on by White House staff members who are cruising the parking lots of the Pentagon, pumping their fists in their limousines and tweeting their support for the blood mob and warning them that counter-revolutionaries inside the Department of Defense and the military are Russian agents and they need to be dealt with by the masses. Whoa, friends, slow down for a minute because let's notice what just happened. The White House has crossed the final line separating them and the country from absolute, unremitting chaos because they have now declared open season on the last functioning institution in the country, the military itself. And if you didn't notice, they've now signaled to would-be activist agitators inside the military that if they want, they can tear up the chain of command itself and bring the chaos into the army. That is what happens. At West Point itself, the commandant of the academy is kidnapped by a faction of radical activist cadets who are egged on by an Air Force colonel. In the story, it's always the Air Force. It's always the Air Force. The commandant of the academy is held prisoner for a month by the Air Force wacko and his minions. Finally, he's rescued by other cadets and professors who have stayed loyal to him and successfully defended a point of resistance inside the academy's motor pool. However, at West Point and military installations throughout the country, the armories have been plundered, and warring factions of civilians, supported by sympathetic soldiers of matching factions, have armed themselves with small arms, grenades, and even field guns from military armories. Most amazingly, the wackadoo fratricide has infected even the military-industrial complex, the country's most important and most highly guarded projects, like their nuke project. This is going to sound amazing, but in Washington, the missile scientists and engineers are the radical ones, and they have started calling for violent revolution inside the Department of Defense's missile procurement offices. The radical activist scientists are being resisted by the custodians and the office staff who remain loyal to the old constitutional order. And the two factions are at war that waxes so hot that one night there's a retaliatory home invasion by the so-called conservative office workers that results in the death by beating of the government's top missile scientist. At this point now, all political certainty has been put into a blender. Nobody knows anymore from day to day whether they're going to be plucked from obscurity and celebrated and supported by the president and his tweet storm tomorrow, or hung out to dry for some imagined reactionary flaw, fed to the military, eaten up by a rival faction. And most disturbingly, that cancer has now been allowed to creep into the army itself, which may mean that the last hope of restoring law and order is gone. See, by this point, even the president himself realizes he has completely lost control. He would like to use what's left of the army to bring some measure of control back to the country. However, it may be too late for that. Friends, you now have a small taste for the enormity of the first 2 years of the Cultural Revolution. That's right. Everything that I've described has taken place between 1966 and 1968. The Cultural Revolution still has another 8 years to run. Today, however, we've accomplished the first job, which is just to help you understand why the episodes that come next in the early and mid 1960s sometimes feel as though they're taking place in a Fellini movie or a surrealist painting where clocks melt inexplicably over deadened tree branches. An air of unreality pervades our story because nothing at all was fixed or certain. Nothing could be taken for granted or be counted on as truly predictable from day to day or week to week. Keep this in mind now as we go back and we return to actual Chinese history. And we continue to follow the story of China's army through the 1960s. Friends, if you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. Please share. If you want, you could go over to our Patreon page, but this channel remains free for all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants. I'm Jason Clower, and I look forward to seeing you next time.